Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Facebook Live in honor of Rare Disease Day. My name is Joe Messeri, and I will be your host for this conversation. Today, the Lymphoma Research Foundation is proud to partner with the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation to discuss specifically cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, which we will refer to as CTCL for the purposes of our conversation. And we are very lucky to have two great guests with us here today. I would like to introduce them both to you now. First, Dr. Lucia Seminario Vidal and Sheila Johnson. Thank you so much, ladies, for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Excellent. Absolutely. Dr. Vidal, I would like to start with you, if I may here. For people who may not be familiar, what is lymphoma specifically?
Yeah, so lymphomas overall, they are cancers of lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are a type of cells that are part of your immune system. If you use a microscope to look at the blood cells that form the immune system, the lymphocyte will look like a fried egg.
And what is cutaneous T-cell lymphoma?
So cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, or CTCL, like you mentioned, are lymphomas that primarily involve the skin. They're classified based on whether they're cancers of B cells, and we're not talking today about cutaneous B-cell lymphoma, but that's another subtype, or T cells. If they involve the T lymphocytes, they're called cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. Cutaneous T-cell lymphoma is the most common type of cutaneous lymphoma, and it occurs in about 5 to 6 per million persons. CTCL, or cutaneous lymphoma, is also used as an umbrella term that includes several subtypes or types of cutaneous T-cell lymphomas. The most common types that a lot of people have heard about are mycosis fungoides and Sézary syndrome.
So, Sheila, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Again, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your diagnosis of CTCL and some of the circumstances surrounding it when you found out?
Wow, that's a lot. So my diagnosis, I was diagnosed about 10 years ago with mycosis fungoides, stage 1A. And it was, of course, a journey getting there. You know, most of us, from my understanding, it takes us on average about 7 years before we get an actual diagnosis, before there's enough going on manifesting in our bodies for any type of test to pick it up. Even at the time I was diagnosed, my skin biopsies were still inconclusive. And so it was the fact that my CD4 and CD8 ratios were out of balance. And so in someone healthy who does not have CTCL, and particularly my type, their CD4 CD8 ratio is a healthy 2 to 1. When I was diagnosed, mine was about 3 to 1. And then, of course, my skin was the other manifestation of it. The round, inflamed, scaly skin, itchy skin. I'm telling you, you're looking at me today, but 10 years ago, you would have been like, whoa, what is going on with her skin? I literally felt like, in the Old Testaments, it talks about the people who had leprosy. And it really and the shame, and the stigma. Why would I be ashamed of a diagnosis? I have no idea. It makes no sense now. But then I was like, oh my God, I can't, so it was quite the journey.
So what first tipped you off that something was wrong?
My skin broke out. And so because as a child, I was one of those kids who was allergic to everything. So much so that I had an allergy shot once a week until I was probably about 15 years old, okay, during peak allergy seasons. And my mother, being an LPN, was always adamant about paying attention to what's going on. So I get this, to me, it looked like a wingworm, It was round, it was raised, it was red, and it was itchy. And so I thought, well, let me go to the let me go to the allergist, because there must be something going on that I'm allergic to. And at that time, I was a project manager for our local natural gas distributor. And so I was always on construction sites. And he thought, well, maybe there's something industrial that I'm allergic to that I'm coming in contact with. Yeah, that was a negative. I wasn't allergic to any. So he sent me to a dermatologist who had been the head of dermatology at the medical center that I now go to. And he said, you might have this rare skin disease. He never called it a lymphoma. Tested me for it. It was inconclusive. With the triamcinolone, the topical steroid, it went away. I just kind of was like, oh, well, went away. It wasn't until 6 years later I had another breakout, and it was exactly the same.
Wow.
So then I knew something else, there's something else going on, because I already knew that my skin is my biggest organ. So if my skin is breaking out, there's something going on in here to make that happen.
Right. So, Dr. Seminario Vidal, let me bring you back in here. What are some of the causes of CTCL that might lead to experiencing some of this?
Okay, I thought it was mute, sorry. So I think Sheila gave us a lot of important information. One thing is that it's very difficult to diagnose cutaneous T-cell lymphoma because it mimics a lot of skin conditions. It can look like eczema, it can look like psoriasis, it can look like ringworm, like she mentioned it. And many times the biopsies will not be able to detect the cancer cells or the blood tests. So I always say dermatologists and oncologists are familiar with the disease, like most of us are. And to diagnose it, we'll have to perform a full physical examination. We need to do skin biopsies many times more than once. Many times we need to do over and over to get the information that we need. We need to do blood studies, molecular studies, and depending how it presents, sometimes we're doing imaging studies like PET-CT or CT scans. Diagnosis of cutaneous lymphomas is like doing a jigsaw puzzle. I feel you need to connect all the pieces to see the complete picture. And many times it takes years to get that complete picture.
Wow. So can you go see a dermatologist, or do you need to see a specialist for this diagnosis?
Well, I always recommend to see a specialist because you need a team that works with you to diagnose and stage the disease and manage it. But like Sheila, she was lucky to have a dermatologist that was very knowledgeable on the disease. So if you don't have a treatment center close where you live, you can go, you can call an office, a dermatology office, or an oncology office, and you say do you guys see patients with cutaneous lymphoma? And most of the time you will receive an answer, yes or no. One of the tricks I tell my patients that come from far away and they want to follow locally is to look at offices that offer phototherapy, light therapy, because that's one of the skin-directed therapies for cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, and not everyone has phototherapy in dermatology. So the offices that have it, usually they are familiar with patients with cutaneous lymphoma to treat that.
So why does CTCL usually present itself on the skin, and how is it different from skin cancer?
Yeah, so in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, the malignant T-cells, they reside in the skin, and then they cause a rash. It is different from other skin cancers like squamous cell carcinomas, basal cell, or even melanoma, because the cell of origin, the T lymphocyte, is part of the immune system. The other skin cancers, the cell of origin is on the skin layers, like the melanocyte, the basal cell, or the keratinocyte. So that's the main difference.
So I know you mentioned that it is very difficult to diagnose CTCL, but what makes it so difficult, and how is it diagnosed?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, it's difficult because it mimics other skin rashes that are super common, like eczema. Like 1 in 10 people in the US have eczema, psoriasis, Also, it's like 1 in 10, 1 in 5, and ringworm. So it looks like other common rashes. That's what is like difficult to diagnose. And most time you will go to your primary doctor. Like Sheila had an allergy, so that's more specialized, but you will not go to a specialist if you think it's something common. And also gets tricky because the topical steroids that we use for eczema and psoriasis also help with cutaneous lymphoma initially. So you can use it, like Sheila, get better, but then it comes back. And you're like, oh, something is odd here.
So, Sheila, when you were diagnosed, how did you tell your family and friends about that diagnosis?
Well, the first thing for me was because I went to the doctor by myself. I didn't want to really, alarm anybody because I really didn't know, what it was. And I'll tell you that my physician at the time, he has since moved on to the University of San Diego. And I keep telling him, I'm going to move to San Diego, right? But his father had it. And so he looked at me and put his hand on my hand and he said, Sheila, he said, you're going to be just fine. He said, we're going to get in front of this. And he said, and you may go some places at stage 1A where you're at, where they wouldn't do anything, where they would just sit, watch, and wait. He said, well, that's not our approach. Our approach is to get in front of it. And because we know what can happen. And so it was his level of assurance, his level of experience, that really kind of helped to calm me. And I just said, and again, my mother being an LPN, I'm like, look, this is what it is, and, of course, she wants the facts. She don't want the, what are they saying? What's your prognosis? Blah, 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 and it was just, and at that time, my daughters were adults by that time. I have two adult daughters. And my oldest daughter, I'm so grateful for her because she said, look, because she's the one who really did all the research online. I didn't do any of that because I didn't want to scare myself. I didn't want to compare me to somebody else. I truly wanted this to be a situation between me and my healthcare team. And so, but she did a lot of research. And so she came back with, never forget, one day she comes over one afternoon and she goes in the kitchen and she just starts pulling stuff out of the cupboards. She's like, yeah, you can't eat none of this. She said, we're going to give it to the pantry because anything in a box, anything in a can, she said, that's all processed stuff. She said, your body is fighting for you every day. So that means you have to eat living things. You cannot eat stuff that's dead and pasteurized and processed. And so and she bought me an old Jack LaLanne juicer and taught me how to use it. And then said to me, these are the things that you need to be consuming, and so I'll never forget when we met with the oncology team for the first time. And so she listens to the oncologist and she said, so what I hear you saying is that my mom's CTCL is indolent. I had never even heard the word indolent. I didn't know what that meant. And he said, first of all, who is this young lady? She knows something.
She's done her homework.
So I just took my daughters, and my mom, on the journey with me. Because, it's like, we're in this to fight. I did see early on, I saw a therapist. And one of the things the therapist asked me in that very first session, she says, Sheila, how long do you want to live? How do you want to be before you transition? And I said, 90. And she said, well, then that's what it's going to be. And so what that said to me is that my mindset is the most powerful tool in this journey.
Right.
And so from that point on, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to live, and I tell everybody, I'm going to live to be a 90-year-old spunky woman.
I believe it. Based on our conversations before our recording here, and so far, I believe it. Yes. But you mentioned something that I think is very important here, and I think a lot of people who might be listening might be in the same position you were in when it comes to hearing the term indolent lymphoma. So I want to bring back Dr. Seminario Vidal. Doctor, what does that mean, and how does it pertain to CTCL?
Yeah, so Sheila, I think like all CTCL experts, we love the word indolent. And you just said that, I was like, I say that all the time to my patients. And I try to explain it, but so like we say that most people that live with cutaneous T-cell lymphomas have an indolent disease. It's the behavior of the disease. It means it's very like slow growing, and it will not cause any immediate problems. So that's the meaning. So the symptoms that you will have at the beginning are either absent. Some people may not have any, may have a rash, but it will not itch, not bother them, or they're very mild and few, like small patch in some area of the body that doesn't itch or itch a little bit. And those symptoms are treatable, but they are not curable. And usually they are not life-threatening. But I agree with your doctor, Sheila. I don't watch and wait. Like I recommend to treat it, get up front of it, and get rid of it, and keep it on remission as long as we can.
So when it comes to CTCL, we hear so often the term stages. How is CTCL staged, and can your stage advance if it is an indolent lymphoma?
Yes, so every subtype of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma that we mentioned, mycosis fungoides, Sézary are the most common, but there are like other types. There might be staged differently, depending on their type. But the most common ones, mycosis fungoides and Sézary syndrome, are staged. They are classified in stage from 1A to 4B. And we use the TNMB system to stage it. Like T stands for tumor, and it describes the involvement of the skin. N is for lymph node involvement, and it tells us if there is involvement of the lymph nodes, if there are malignant cells there or not. M is for metastasis, and which means if there is any involvement of organs that are not the skin or the lymph nodes or the blood. And B is blood involvement. So that's why we need all the tests that I mentioned before, like skin biopsies, imaging studies to look at the lymph nodes, blood tests to see if there are any blood involvement. So we need that information. And stages 1A to 2A are considered early stage disease, and the majority of patients with cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, mycosis fungoides type, will present in early stages. 2B to 4B is a later stage, and a minority of patients present with that.
So, Sheila, when you were first diagnosed, do you remember what stage you were in during that diagnosis?
Yeah, he staged me at 1A. But he wouldn't stage me until after, and actually he kind of went back and forth between 1A and 1B. And 1B because I had an enlarged lymph node under my arm. And so he immediately had it removed, and there was no cancer in it. And so because there was no cancer in it, then he put me back at stage 1A. And I had, and the amount of coverage, or skin symptoms, that was visible on my skin. And again, that blood work, that CD4, CD8 panel, that was also used to determine that. So I was like, but the interesting thing is that I have learned that a lot of people, with stage 1A, all they ever need is a topical thing. Well, after I did phototherapy for probably about 8 months, 6 months, 8 months, it was under a year, he runs that panel again, and my CD4, CD8 ratios have gone up. And he's like, whoa, that's not, and it had gone up to about almost 6-1. And so he's like, yeah, no, it's time to get the oncologist involved. And so he suggested photopheresis for me. And I got a port because my veins won't sustain that kind of treatment. And I started at 2 treatments every other week. So basically 4 treatments a month. And years later, matter of fact, I had treatment this week. Yesterday and Thursday, I get 2 treatments every 8 weeks. So that's and it keeps my CD4, CD8 at about 2.69 to 1. And my skin I get flare-ups, but what I notice is that and it's because in the early stages of this, I documented a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that, and first of all, I can feel it when my skin, I'm like, my skin is feeling kind of funny. And I can't even describe what that funny feeling is, but I know it. So then I go, okay, Sheila, what do I need to do in my lifestyle choices so I immediately start doing a detox. And so that means if I'm having any alcohol, drinking, eating any fast foods, any fried foods, I immediately cut all those out. And then I start making sure that I'm drinking 80 ounces of water or more a day. And so then paying close attention to what I'm putting on my skin, what I'm washing my hair in, am I getting enough rest, those sorts of things. And so after I enact that, and then I start using the trimensolone, and in about 5 days, it's that little rash, that little inflamed spot that it may have showed up on my cheek is now gone.
So obviously now, having gone through all this, I mean, you're talking in what might seem like a foreign language to somebody who's newly diagnosed or hearing about this for the first time. I'm curious, when you were first diagnosed, what did you know about lymphoma, and how did you find out all the information? Obviously, you mentioned the help from your daughter, but were there any other good resources that you went to at the time?
So the only thing I knew about lymphoma was that it was a cancer, and a cancer related to the blood. That was the only thing that I knew. And I connected early on with my local LLS Foundation, Lymphoma Society. And I did a little bit of like awareness stuff with them. But it wasn't specific to CTCL. It was just kind of like a general umbrella of lymphomas. And I resorted a lot to my team. I asked a lot of questions, of my nurses, of my doctors. When you get that blood work panel back, where I go, they give you copies of that. And so that was my opportunity to learn, what are they looking at? And why are they looking at that? And, and overall, how does it impact? And so I would just ask, what does this mean? And then I jot down, okay, that means that. So then when I got that blood panel back, if the numbers were too high or too low, I'm like, did you see this was high or low? What does this mean? And what are we going to do about it? And so so I really kind of just took what information I could get, but I wanted to make sure it was not just information that was just out there, that it was solid sources. I didn't learn of the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation until a year after I was diagnosed, and probably because I didn't research anything. I really relied heavily on my doctor, because he set that tone early on, that we're in this together. And I remember asking him about, what can I do? I know science plays its role, what can I do? And he's like, Sheila, take care of yourself, eat well, and take care of yourself. Try not to stress. And I will tell you that after my diagnosis, I left corporate America, because I'm like, nothing is going to stress me, because I can't afford to, and so I, that hustle and bustle and, all of that entails with corporate America. I'm like, yeah, no, I'm not doing that anymore. And it was, of course, a big decision, especially when that's been your life, what do you do now to earn money, so that, and I had to, come to that. I had to, of course, make some lifestyle changes, but and I hear people say this all the time about CTCL, it is a marathon. And so in order for me to get to that 90, I know that there are some things that I had to be conscious of, and I had to really get rid of the fear, is what I had to really work on getting rid of. Because when you wake up, and I've been there, when you wake up every day and you look at yourself in the mirror and you know that you're living with this cancer and there's no cure for it, you have to wrap your mind around your own mortality. What does that look like? What does that mean? And so I remember being in the, when I did do phototherapy, I got into the booth and I developed several mantras. And one of them is, I am healthy, I am fit, I am the center of abundance, and I am the perfect size 8. And so I just say this over and over again, and it's always taped on my bathroom mirror. And today I choose faith over fear, because if I'm afraid of it, then for me that meant I'm not going to be as knowledgeable because I'm afraid of what I might hear. And so I had to really work on getting rid of that fear and be like, look at here, you got to know, because if you don't know, there's nothing you can do about it, but so that's kind of what I did to gain information, was just, and I think again, really knowing my body was key.
Right, right. Dr. Sheila shared with us a little bit about the fact that her team was going to take an aggressive approach to treating the CTCL. But I'm curious, is there a standard of care that exists for CTCL right now?
Well, there is no standard of care. There are actually like more than 30 different treatments for cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, and newer treatments are becoming quickly available. So to destroy the cancer cells that are located on the skin, we have skin-directed therapies that include creams like topicals, creams, gels, lotion, light therapy that we call phototherapy. You can also use radiation therapy for when it's more extensive on the skin. And when the disease is in more advanced stages, like involving the lymph nodes or the blood or multiple sites, we use systemic therapies that are either pills, IV infusions, or shots, photopheresis, and many times we're combining this treatment for our patients.
So with that being said, are clinical trials encouraged for CTCL patients?
Yeah, so the best management for any cancer is a clinical trial, including CTCL. I believe that most of the treatments that we have now is because the clinical trials that we are doing, that we did in the past. So we cannot advance or find a cure for the disease if we're not doing clinical trials. So it's very important to participate in that. The NCCN, which is the National Comprehensive Cancer Network that encompasses several cancer centers, it has in all the first pages for their treatment recommendations, first treatment option should be a clinical trial if available.
Wow. Are there any promising new treatments that are coming on for CTCL right now?
This is a very exciting time because I think 10 years ago, there were nothing going on clinical trials, or maybe one every couple of years. Now there are a lot of clinical trials going on. I'm just going to mention a few that are very exciting. One is an antibody that binds a protein called KIR3DL2 that is present in tumor cells. So this is being tested in patients with early stages and also patients with Sézary syndrome. Another one are combination therapies. For example, total skin radiation therapy combined with an immune enhancer of IL-12. And there is also a study coming with light therapy that's already I think on the latest, that's hopefully is going to get approved soon. That's a cream that makes the skin more sensitive to the light in the area that you apply it, and it's to visible light. It's not even any type of special light to visible light. There's also another combination treatment that uses the monoclonal antibody that binds to an antigel called CCR4, and it's combining that with light therapy. So I think there are a lot of very exciting things going on currently.
It sounds like it. So then when a patient hears this, I mean, I feel like you can get a little bit overwhelmed. What are some of the important questions that a patient with CTCL needs to be asking their healthcare provider?
So I have a story to tell here. When I was in training, some time ago, a few years ago. Like one of my patients that inspired me to do what I'm doing was one of my patients with CTCL. Like he came to the consult, like Sheila, and he had 2 pages of questions. But I was like, I never seen anyone like own their disease, like wanted to know about it. So like I sat with him, we went question by question, like I
Wow.
helped him write down my answers because it's so many that probably he will forget. Like, so I started writing down my answers, and so it's very important like to have questions. Like the things that I always recommend is what type of lymphoma you have, like Sheila asked, what's your stage, what's your prognosis. So I think those are the 3 main questions. Know your disease. Then you can ask about the treatment options. Because I mentioned there are multiple treatments, like more than 30 treatment options for depending on the stage. So you need to know what's the treatment, how does it work? I'm sure she'll ask those questions. Not everybody wants to know how it works. They want to know if it works or not. But the benefits and the risks, like what are the adverse effects of the treatment that you may get? What are the benefits? How long it will take to see a response? I always tell my patients, it's not like eczema that you use it for 2 weeks and it's gone. You may use some of these creams for 3 to 6 months, and then you see some improvement. So it takes a longer time. Also about cost, because there are many treatments that are not FDA approved, that insurance don't cover. So we can give patients an idea, like every insurance is different, so we don't know like all the coverage, but at least an idea that this usually gets covered for people your age. This is very difficult to get it covered. We can try it, but let's start treatment A instead of B until we make sure that treatment B is covered by your insurance. What is the best way to contact your team? Like it might be like I'm in clinic all the time, but my nurse is available. So here's the phone number of my nurse. You can call her if you have questions. Or nowadays that we have portals, like you can send a question through the patient portal and we'll answer it like later, anytime. And where you can get the treatments, a lot of people go to cancer centers for like diagnosis or staging or a second opinion, but then it's far away from where they live. But most cancer centers, like we know our local providers, like our dermatologists, oncologists that are familiar with the disease. So we can tell our patients, in this area, you can find these doctors that treat your disease. Or even if we don't know, like we can contact somebody and guide them through the treatment. So we don't need to see them so often. They don't need to drive 2, 3, 4 hours to see us. And we can just like keep in touch via phone, now Zoom or virtually. I think that has changed a lot for our patients that come from far away. But yeah, I think that those are like the most common questions that I ask my patients. And I tell them, don't worry if you write 2 pages of questions. We'll answer your questions. That's why you're here, and we'll go from there.
And you've been dealing with that since your training, so way back in day one.
Yeah.
Sheila, I'm curious, what do you feel were some of the most important questions that you asked when you got your diagnosis, and how did it shape and guide your treatment, and what treatment did you actually end up going with?
So like when we discovered that my CD4 CD8 ratios had gone up, so there were 2 actually treatment options that were presented to me. One was the photopheresis, the other was interferon. Okay. And so it's like, okay, what is that? And so, my doctor kind of tells me what those are. And I said, with the interferon, the whole idea that it causes some patients to depression. And I'm like, oh no, I'm not dealing with that at all, unless I absolutely have to. And so, and his comeback for me was, he says, well, Sheila, you're positive, you're upbeat. It may not impact you that way. And I said, yeah, but we don't know, right? And I'm not even willing to take that risk. So let's go with the photopheresis. And so that is how I ended up, and even having to wrap my mind around that I was going to have to get a port and what all of that means. Not everybody has to get a port with photopheresis, but I did, and so when he basically just said to me, this is what photopheresis is going to do. It's going to take out basically a cup of your blood. They're going to separate the red from the white blood cells. The white blood cells are where the T cells and the lymphocytes are that are, doing what they're not supposed to do. And we're going to treat it with a medicine called Uvadex. And then through this machine, we're going to expose it to UVA and UVB rays. And so I said, oh, you're giving my white blood cells a suntan. And he said, well, yeah, you can look at it that way. And then we infuse it on back into your body. And so by doing that, that process kills those cells that are trying to mutate. And it also, there's that immunotherapy portion of it that's there that says, hey, to the cells, you're not supposed to be dividing like that, okay? So it helps with cell memorization. And so then I looked at what the side effects are, and there are some side effects, but I have not experienced any of the side effects. And so when I'm at treatment, I take my laptop and I'm working. I've done conference calls, all of that. And then after I'm done,
and you left corporate America, right?
Yeah, well, right, exactly. And so it has truly been, and that's the only treatment that I have. Again, if my skin flares up, I will use a little bit of triamcinolone to, get that under control. But I focus more on what's going on internally, what's made that. And so is there something I can do? So I realign myself. I get myself back in balance first. And then it never fails for me. Every time I get myself back in balance, and then my skin clears right back up.
Doctor, as we're talking about these treatment options, I'm curious, do they vary for patients with relapse refractory CTCL?
Yes, so because the chronic nature of cutaneous T-cell lymphomas and recurrent nature of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, a lasting, complete, clear response is rare. Usually people like Sheila will be clear for a long time and then have a flare, relapse, or become treatment refractory. So the term relapse is that the disease has gone away, but it reappears. And refractory, it means that when the lymphoma is not responding to the treatment, it's getting worse, progressing. So the treatments for relapse or refractory cutaneous T-cell lymphoma are usually systemic therapies. Some are like immunotherapies, like interferon, like Sheila mentioned. Some are antibody-based, like brentuximab, mogamulizumab, and others even we use sometimes chemotherapy, like gemcitabine. And of course, clinical trials. Most of the clinical trials are directed to relapsed refractory cutaneous T-cell lymphomas.
Now, when it comes to CTCL, some of the studies are showing that African-American patients are more likely to present with a higher stage of CTCL at an earlier age in life. Is there a reason for this?
Yeah, so there are not many studies out there yet, but I know there's a big effort to do more research in the area. And the studies that identify that African Americans present with a higher stage and early on, and they have suggested some clues why this is happening. So one is that the disease onset in African Americans is earlier than in Caucasians. So that's one thing that has been identified. Another item is socioeconomic factors. Such as quality and access to care. Overall, not only cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, but more like cancers, there's a higher prevalence of poverty, lower insurance coverage that is seen in patients like African Americans and patients of skin of color, so including Hispanics, Native Americans too. So that negatively impacts the access to care to the patients. And finally, in skin of color, it's more difficult to diagnose cutaneous T-cell lymphomas. And that's something that we're working on, in dermatology, most textbooks, have pictures, in lighter color skin. So dermatologists don't learn how to diagnose cutaneous T-cell lymphoma in darker skin types. This is changing. I think in the last 5 years, it's been a big movement to include a lot of pictures with skin of color, but red in white can look very different than red on darker skin type. Can look like very different. And many times our patients of skin of color have a variant called hypopigmented mycosis fungoides, which is like lighter spots. So it's not even the classical presentation. So I think
Wow.
all of those combined make it more challenging to diagnose.
So in addition to the change we're seeing at the educational level, is there anything else being done to address some of these racial disparities in the treatment of CTCL?
Yeah, what I'm seeing like more recently, I think in the last 2 years, like or even last year, because of the political scenario that we're going through, is there are several initiatives among institutions, like they're prioritizing measurement of health disparities, like as a metric for the institution, for the cancer center. They are doing trainings like in health disparities and also racial biases in healthcare like staff, which things that we didn't have before. So like 5 years ago, we didn't have those type of training. So I think that's helping. And there we're also building partnerships between the institutions and the population of African American patients to see what's meaningful for them. Because sometimes the institution may have an idea that's completely different to what the patients are thinking. And so like I think like most institutions, cancer centers, and are making racial equity like a priority, like at least like I've seen it recently in several of the hospitals that I work. That's a big priority. And also there are newer funding initiatives. So you want to do research, but you don't have funding. It's hard to move things. But now there are a lot of funding options that are helping researchers, like including my team. We're doing also some research in racial disparities in our patients with cutaneous T-cell lymphomas.
Wow, that's great. You know, Doctor, you mentioned some of the, you can give a little applause there, Sheila. That's great.
I love it. Yes.
You know, you mentioned some of the financial hardships that you see, and I'm curious because, Sheila, you mentioned leaving the corporate world, and I'm sure that there's a lot of stressors that come along with that when it comes to the financial situation and paying for all this. So I'm curious, how did you cope with that financial stress while you're going through the treatment and everything that comes along with that diagnosis?
So fortunately, even though I work for a small family-owned business, there's only about 25 of us. Now, I have good insurance, but it costs me $500 a month out of my pocket. Okay, that's just the premium. Okay, and so each photopheresis treatment is $13,000.
Wow.
And so this year, my total annual out-of-pocket expense is $6,000. And so what I stay in constant communication with my medical hospital that I go to. I'm like, look, I'm gonna send you $200 this time, $100 this time, $500 this time. And so I think by doing that, by maintaining that relationship with the business office side of it, I don't get collection calls and all of that, but, and I just said, I can't let money be the barrier, between me and my life. Like, are you kidding? But fortunately, because I had positioned myself and had made certain decisions and luck or blessings, however we want to look at it, I never had to I never had to say, no, I can't afford that treatment. I probably better go with this one. And because for me, and I'm not raising children anymore. My kids are grown. So it's just me. I'm an empty nester. And so that means if I had to spend all of my earnings on it, would that be ideal? No. But I changed my lifestyle in every other area so that I could compensate for this, but it can be, and I have talked to other patients, I call us warriors, other CTCL warriors, where it has been a challenge, and they haven't tried photopheresis because of the expense, and so they feel like they're in this little hamster wheel, just with the steroids and the radiation here or there, but they've had to make those hard choices, and it's unfortunate. I often, the big thing about, what do you call it? Like, I don't want to say like government ran insurance or universal health care. And so in one of my support groups that I'm in, there was a young lady who's in the UK, and she was wanting to see another doctor. She wasn't happy with her doctor. And so us in the United States, we're like, go find a doctor. And she's like, it doesn't work that way. If you didn't have private insurance prior to that major diagnosis, you couldn't even pay for it if you wanted it. Okay. And so she can't just say, I want to go see another doctor. There's a whole process in place. And if the medical board doesn't view that as being a valid reason, she can't go see another doctor. And I'm like, oh no. I'm like, So I'm like, we are so, now on the flip side of it, our healthcare stuff is so astronomical. It's so expensive. It's kind of like, but we have a choice. You know, I can, if I don't like my doctors, I can call up a doctor at MD Anderson and say, hey, this is my insurance. I want to come down there. And I don't have to go through that process. You know, I don't have those type of barriers, you know, to having choices to my care. I have a say so. And it just appears as though those who are in those countries where they have universal health care, they're limited. It's like they don't, and I'm like, I don't want for us to get to that point. I like having a choice, you know, and it can be that during the day, I am what's called a social services director for senior citizens. And so every day I'm on the phone with Medicare and Medicaid and their pharmaceutical companies. And, you know, and so it is, and I see them struggle with having to pay for their meds or pay for their rent. And I'm like, we're gonna write that pharmaceutical company a letter, and we're gonna tell them about you, and then we're gonna ask them to help you. And you know, every single time I've done it, the pharmaceutical companies are like, yes, fill out this form, we'll be happy to help. And so I think part of it is knowing how to navigate around that,
right.
You know, because, you know, they don't nobody says you can ask the pharmaceutical company, and because most of them have some sort of financial assistance program, but nobody tells you that, you know, and so we have to figure out how to navigate. And again, I go back to my team. I remember being in treatment, and at this time, I had been in between. I was working for YMCA, and there had been a reorg, and I got caught in the reorg and got laid off. My COBRA was almost $800 a month.
Wow.
And so I'm talking to a friend on the phone about it. The nurse comes in, and she's like, I'm not eavesdropping, but I heard you say this, and can I call the business office on your behalf? And I'm like, absolutely you can. And so after treatment, she's like, Sheila, go upstairs and ask to speak to John. And I don't know what they can do, but I know that there's something that can be done.
Right.
And the hospital which is KU Medical Center, they paid that COBRA premium for 18 months.
Wow.
And so had that nurse, I would have never thought to go ask. But it's such a simple thing, but most of us never think that we have the right to ask for things like that. And so again, had my nurse not have overheard my conversation, I would have been struggling. I would have went over to my mama's house to eat dinner, but I would have paid that $800 a month because I know I needed the treatment.
Right, right.
So it does, and I think awareness during September, you know, is Leukemia Lymphoma Awareness Month, and I typically I do find people in my community, and typically they are going to be African American, so that we can educate each other on what it is. And so I invite them into on the show, on the cooking show, and we talk about their diagnosis. It's not necessarily CTCL, but it's a lymphoma, it's a leukemia. And so that's me, somebody who looks like me, sharing this information with somebody who looks like me. And so there's that cultural relevance, you know, and that trust, you know, that we can build. And by doing that, I've had people reach out to me and say, you know what, I've had this rash. And I'm like, honey, call. Here's a number. Can you call them? I don't know what it is. you don't know what it is. But one thing's for certain is that it's there. And so your body is talking to you. And so just being able to share, and initially I wouldn't tell anybody, publicly like that. Now I'm like, yeah, I live with this really rare thing. I said, y'all, that just means I'm really, really special. There's no cure for it.
I love it.
And if I can do it, look, you know what? Know what's going on. And I use my story to, just to share and encourage people that no matter what it is that's going on, I want you to seek help. If you don't know how, I'm like, send me an inbox. You know what? And I'll help you do the research, and so we can get you in the right direction that you need to. And I think a lot of it is just awareness,
Right.
awareness, knowing what's out there.
Sheila, how long have you been in remission?
Now, see, it's interesting you use that term because my doctors never use that term.
Oh, so what term does he? What do you say, or what does he say?
It's inactive, and so, or it's indolent. It's not inactive, and so about 7 years.
Wow.
So I was diagnosed 10 years ago, and so it took about 3 years to get me on a path of being clear and yeah.
And doctor, hearing that first, one, the fact that Sheila's doctor doesn't use the term remission, and two, that it has been inactive, we'll say, for 7 years. What are your thoughts on both of those? First of all, the terminology, and two, just the fact that it's been that long.
Well, I'm very happy that it's been inactive for 7 years. That's not that common. I think most people have some relapses. And I usually use remission. So I think different terms. I use remission when you cannot see the disease on the skin, when you cannot detect it in the blood. But because there is no cure, like, I'm not saying bye, you're done. It's like we still need to monitor you or your local dermatologist, oncologist, because it can come back, and it can come back as a tiny spot on your back, and then we need to treat it. So, and inactive, I think some of my colleagues use it like interchangeable, but I like how it sounds, inactive.
Okay. You were very excited before when we talked about some of the new therapies that are coming up. What has you most excited about CTCL Research now, and why?
Well, this is a personal reason, because my institution at Moffitt, they just did like a really interesting discovery. Some of our basic scientists, they have a mouse model of Sézary syndrome, and they found in that mouse model that expression of a protein called SATB1, which stands for Special AT-Rich Sequence Binding Protein 1, contributes to CTCL development in this mouse model. And they found that a medication, a drug that blocks the methylation of this protein, may be a potential treatment. So I get excited when we find something that can be translated and that has a future as potential new treatment for our patients.
That's fantastic.
Awesome.
I want to go back to Sheila for a second here. I'm curious, having been through what you've been through, and seeing where you are now, what advice would you give to somebody who was newly diagnosed with lymphoma?
I would say, first of all, learn how to be your own advocate. And because I think that in itself carries you so far, and even as though I'm inactive, but I still see my oncologist every 6 months. And every time I see him, I got questions for him, and so, and I write those questions down. I don't, leave it to my memory. I write them down so that, and he's ready for me when I come. So like when I come, we're going to be talking about this COVID vaccine. And so, because I'm concerned about that.
Right.
And, and for, all kinds of reasons, but, it's like, hey, let's talk about it. Here's my questions. Here's my concerns. So, and then he'll have the opportunity to, to share. I'm sure he'll be telling me all the reasons probably why I need to get it, but
I'm curious, when did you find out about the Lymphoma Research Foundation, and has the foundation helped in any way in helping you navigate some of those questions that you might have had?
So I actually found out about the Research Foundation through the CTCL Foundation. And so I haven't had any like direct experience with the Research Foundation. I just heard, and I've heard Susan and her team talk about them and the work that they're doing together. And so, and I'm, I try to be in the know on what's going on over there at the at the CTCL Foundation. So that's how I actually heard about the Research Foundation.
Excellent. I'm curious, Doctor, what are some of the resources that you will refer your patients to when somebody comes in and they're newly diagnosed?
Yeah, so after we answer the questions, I always tell them to write them down for next visit. We have like handouts about the treatments that we are prescribing them, or even about the ones that we talk, because we're like, okay, we may not use this treatment right now, but we talk about it, have some information from a reliable source. But now that everyone has their phone with internet, I always recommend the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation, because they have resources from diagnosis, staging, patient testimonies, like financial, like advice, resources that can help patients with their treatment finances, and even research staff they have there. So I think it's a great site. NCCN, which is the National Cancer Center Network, they have a little bit about cutaneous lymphomas. So are the ones that I recommend.
That's fantastic. Well, ladies, I really want to thank you both for taking the time today and obviously sharing your stories, advice, and experiences with our audience. I know they're going to benefit greatly from listening to this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Sheila, you're an inspiration for all of us.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for the work that you do for us, for my fellow warriors.
Oh.
I echo those sentiments from both of you there, ladies. I want to, for our audience out there listening, I want to remind them that to learn more about cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, you can visit LRF's CTCL Learning Center. That's at lymphoma.org/CTCL, or of course, the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation's website at clfoundation.org. Thank you again for participating, for listening, and for tuning into this program. We really appreciate your time, and we will talk to you next time. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you to the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation for their partnership on this program. This program was supported by Kiowa Kirin as part of the Lymphoma Research Foundation's Health Equity Initiative. For more information and resources, visit lymphoma.org or clfoundation.org.